Austerity Press, The Twilight of American Imperialism, and has several previous books which are listed in the announcements that went out. Two of them I was fortunate enough to read when I first got to know Jack, where he was teaching some classes, and his books have been very helpful, I think. And for those who want to keep in contact, he has a website that I'm sure he'll say something about, where he puts out articles and with really great insight into the current economic state. So with that introduction, Jack, take it away.
Okay. Well, if you want to follow my thinking and writing on this, my website is jackrasmus.com. Day-to-day developments, I comment on maybe half a dozen times on Twitter. I'm at drjackrasmus, and I have a weekly radio show on Progressive Radio Network that's called Alternative Visions, 2 o'clock Eastern Time every Friday. And there I kind of go in depth in a verbal way on trends of the previous week and other topics, not just the economy, but also the global political situation, the wars going on, and also the election. So those 3 topics I cover quite a bit. Today, I'll try to talk about the US economy, where we are really at. And it's kind of like an interesting juncture. Last week, it seems the media and mainstream discovered that, oh, gee, maybe the real economy is not doing so good. It's not just inflation. And we'll talk about that. I want to talk about how we got to where we are right now in the US economy, the origins of this, and where it's probably going, in the course of which I want to pretty much debunk some of the statistics that you see in the mainstream media, whether it's inflation or jobs or GDP or whatever. I think that's important to understand what the real picture of the economy is. And then a little bit about the global economy, and then about the US empire, the global economic empire, why it's increasingly in trouble. You probably heard that theme in different places. Rise of the BRICS and so forth. So put a little of analysis with regard to that, because that will certainly impact the US economy domestically going forward, and we'll try to explain why. Okay, so let's jump right into it. I think what do we got, an hour, James, and then Q&A? Is that what the format is?
That's right.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure it'll generate a lot of questions that I won't be able to cover in an hour, but let's look at the status of the US economy here at the end of summer of 2024. As I said at the beginning, we've heard a lot of talk over the past year or so about soft landing. What's the soft landing? Soft landing is when you bring inflation down below 2%. And you don't precipitate a recession in the process and a large increase in unemployment. Kind of a difficult trick to pull off, but that's been the talk up to now about, inflation is preventing us from a soft landing. I wrote an article about a year ago about this question of soft landing. You can read it on my blog. And I've been writing over the last couple of years about what are the causes driving inflation and what are its prospects going forward. So I've been sort of talking about whether there's going to be a soft landing. I think the title of that article on soft landing was the economic airplane is still circling, and it hasn't come in on the final approach yet. In other words, there's been no soft landing because inflation has been chronically high until just recently, according to official statistics. I'll explain why they lowball inflation. But according to official statistics now, over the summer, we've seen the CPI and the PCE, Consumer Price Index, and Personal Consumption Expenditures Index. Those are the 2 inflation indexes that the government uses. They've come in pretty low in the last couple months, pretty much leveling off in PCE and the CPI uh, a bit higher here. So it looked like, oh, well, maybe there's going to be a soft landing as far as inflation is concerned. But then all of a sudden now it's begun to appear that, well, gee, maybe the real economy is not doing so good as we thought it was. Well, of course, if the economy is weakening, inflation is going to come down, and vice versa. Inflation comes down when the economy weakens. So the two are related. But the two are still a problem in my view, because I believe inflation is underestimated, and I'll explain why. And I believe the economy, the real economy, is much worse than the statistics actually are saying. You see, there's all kind of government statistics. There's a mountain of government statistics, and some of them say something quite the opposite of other statistics. But you can cherry pick the ones you want, pretty much, to show what you really want to say. And that's why they always pick the PCE index on inflation, because it lowballs inflation. I'll explain why. And why they pick the GDP without breaking it down into its elements to see what is really going on. The truth is not in these cherry picked statistics, which I'm not saying are false. I'm just saying that I can find whatever statistic I want to pretty much say whether the economy is doing great or it's not doing great. So it depends on what statistic you want to choose and you want to emphasize. For example, just briefly, I'll jump ahead here. Unemployment. They keep saying, "Oh, the unemployment rate is only 4.3%." Well, what they don't tell you is that that's what's called the U-3 unemployment rate, that only focuses on full-time workers. We got 168 million people in the labor force. About 120 of them are full-time, but we have almost 50 million who are part-time, but they're not included in that U-3 number of 4.3%. Actually, if you count the part-time workers and some other elements, it's like 7.5% unemployment. They don't mention that, do they? But that's a government statistic too. Is just as relevant and accurate as the 4.3%. That's just an example of how you can cherry pick the number you want to emphasize whether the economy is doing good or not so good. We'll talk about those job stats a little bit more going forward. The same thing with the consumer price index versus the PCE price index. One has a much higher inflation rate than the other one does. We'll explain why, and why both, in my opinion, are underestimating inflation. And then, of course, GDP, and what are the problems in GDP that I believe also underestimate inflation. I mean, the economy. But let's jump back and start with the COVID recession in 2020, right? What's an overview of the economy from 2020, 21, 22, 23, and then we'll look at 24, the 6-7 months of 24. What do we see in those 3 years? Well, the COVID economy was a very serious shutdown, mandatory shutdown, that caused GDP to collapse pretty much. And of course, when people were out of jobs, they weren't buying particularly services, and the inflation index, dropped to zero, pretty much. So inflation was zero, and then jobs, were massive. At one time in 2020, there were 35 million people unemployed. 35 million. A lot of those returned to work pretty quickly. But a very large number, it took, another 12, 18 months to return to those jobs. Yet you find that the Biden administration says, "Oh, I created 15 million jobs." No, you didn't create 15 million jobs. 12 million was told to stay home. And then you opened the economy and they came back to jobs that already existed. You didn't create 15 million jobs. Since the economy fully opened by 2022, there have been about 3 million jobs that have been created. So yeah, you've created 3 million jobs, Biden, Harris. But as we will see, most of those are part-time jobs. They're not really full-time jobs. We have a significant decline over this whole period in full-time jobs, while we have a rise in part-time jobs. What happened when the economy started opening up again? There was an attempt to open it up in the third, fourth quarter of 2020, which didn't work because there was another big wave of COVID and we didn't have the vaccines yet. And then when we finally got the vaccine in spring of 21, there was an attempt to open it up again. That aborted. And it wasn't really to the third quarter of 2021 that the economy really reopened. In other words, everyone started going back to work. But the problem was the employers had shut down and they couldn't really bring everybody back at once. And they had problems with supply chains, both global and domestic, and goods and employment. We had a real supply problem, a real supply shortage problem. And what happened was corporations took a big advantage of that, the supply problem, and prices shot up 9–10% in the CPI index, mostly goods related, because we had a problem, with shipping and transport and employment. So the inflation that erupted in 2021 was really a supply side inflation. It was said, argued, in Wall Street Journal and other business interests, we gave people too much money here with the bailout, and there's really a demand-driven inflation. Well, that's really not true, because people were pretty much brought back to work in the spring and summer 21, but inflation didn't erupt until late summer, fall of 21. So, people were spending again when they first came back for 3–4 months, but you don't see any real rise in inflation during that summer. You see it when the supply chain problem erupted in the fall of 2021 and continued to be a problem for some time. So it wasn't excess demand, as economists would say, that set off the inflation. It was supply chain problems. And then you had overlaid on top of that, following that, corporate price gouging with corporations that were able, because of monopoly positions, to jack up their prices. And that was in terms of goods prices and also in services prices. If you remember, the airlines started price gouging, and hotels too, when people started traveling again. So you have the price gouging, which is a supply side problem, overlaid on top of the true supply chain problem. And the gouging continued into 2022 here. Jobs, as I said, started to return, people returning to work. And then in 2022, you started to see some real net job growth occurring. So what happens to GDP, the measure of the economy, during 2021, 22? Well, and obviously when the economy opens up, right, you got a lot of economic activity. Prior to that, in the second, third quarter, it had collapsed. I think like 35%, the economy collapsed that quarter. And then, of course, you get the opening of the economy. So GDP takes a big leap in the second half of 2020 as the economy tried to reopen. You can't count that as economic growth. That's an aberration due to the big contraction earlier in 2020. In fact, not until the economy begins to really reopen and people get back to work in the summer 21, fall of 21, can you say, oh, you're getting some economic growth. But you really don't have a full year of natural economic activity. So you got to look to 2022 and 2023 for any real actual economic growth. And, what do we see? Well, in 2021, we see a GDP growth averaging between 3 and 7%. Okay, that's not bad, 3 and 7%. But, remember 2021, the economy hadn't fully opened. So a lot of that is not real net growth. A lot of that is just reopening of the economy. It's not until 2022 that you can say we have some real economic activity. And what did we see in 2022? Well, the first half of 2022, we had a double dip recession. Yeah, the economy contracted for 6 months again in 2022. People aren't aware of that, and the media, of course, didn't talk much about that. And in 2022, what we see is the Biden administration cuts off the COVID household spending relief programs, takes that money and gives it to businesses in 2022 to try to stimulate investment. We get 3 bills from Biden. We got the infrastructure bill, 2022. We get the chip and modernization bill, and there is a handout to the semiconductor and tech companies. And we get the so-called Inflation Reduction Act in 2022. That's another stimulus of $1.7 trillion that goes to investment. In other words, subsidies to businesses. Really egregious was, the Chip and Modernization Act, where the government gives $52 billion to chip companies that were profitable. And not only companies like Intel, they got almost $20 billion, but companies, foreign companies like Samsung and others, TSMC, right? The government is throwing money at corporations, particularly the tech companies, under the cover of, well, we want them to come back here to the US because we can't go to war with China by 2030 if all our tech companies are still over there, right? So they're subsidizing and bringing them back. But the point is $1.7 trillion in additional stimulus in 2022. What was the original stimulus in 2021? It was $8 trillion. $8 trillion. $4 trillion of Fed stimulus, giving it to banks and investors when they didn't need it. Unlike 2008-9, the banks were in trouble and needed bailing out. Well, this time in 2020, they weren't in trouble at all, but they got bailed out anyway with $4 trillion, a pre-bailout, only time we ever did that. And then there was about $4 trillion in fiscal spending, relief spending of various kinds and programs, the CARES Act and the Emergency Act and the Relief Act and so forth. So $8 trillion in fiscal stimulus in 2021, and then another $1.7 trillion on top of that in 2022. That's almost a $10 trillion stimulus. And what did we get for that mountain of fiscal monetary stimulus in terms of GDP growth? Well, I said, in first half, we had a contraction, but its economy began to recover. In 2023, we had an average of 3% GDP for $10 trillion, not much for $10 trillion. And in 2024, what we got was a 1.4% GDP growth in the first quarter of this year, followed by a 2.8% in the second quarter. I'll explain why 2.8% is not 2.8% and why the economy is still growing about 1%, 1 to 1.5%. But you got to put it in the context of $9.7 trillion in fiscal monetary stimulus. And what do we get? Not very much growth. Something's broken in fiscal monetary policy. Something is really broken. Neither lowering interest rates stimulates the economy as it used to in years past. Neither raising interest rates really dampens inflation. It dampens the goods inflation, but not the services inflation, right? We have chronic inflation here up until just recently of 5% or more in CPI services. Yes, goods inflation has come down, but goods is only 20% of the economy. So 80% of the economy is services. Right? So fiscal monetary policy is not working. I wrote about this in some detail and predicted it, James, in my follow-on book to the one you mentioned. In 2017, I wrote a book called Central Bankers at the End of Their Ropes, and why monetary stimulus, interest rates, QE, does not elicit the same bang for the buck. In other words, interest rate reduction getting real investment, nor does it work the opposite way, interest rate hikes dampening inflation very much. It just is not as efficient as it used to be. And the same with fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is not working the way it typically does in the decades past. So why is this? Why is in the 21st century fiscal monetary policy not very effective? Well, it has to do with the financialization of the US global economy and the globalization of the economy. Now, that's a whole topic I'm not going to go into here, but I do in my next book, Twilight of American Empire. But it's worth mentioning that this mountain of fiscal monetary stimulus did not produce very much because fiscal monetary policies are not working the way they used to, given the changes in the global capitalist economy in the 21st century. Okay, so we'll return to the GDP in 2024. Let's look at this. Let's look at this a little bit in detail, and I hope I'm not too, well, I'm going to try to be clear on this. This is the economist talk, okay? A GDP is made up of 4 elements, right? It's made up of investment, business investment, consumption, which is 2/3 of the economy, government spending, and what's called net exports, or sale of exports minus imports. Imports subtract from GDP, exports add to GDP. So if you have a negative net exports, as it's called, you have a subtraction from GDP. Okay, having said that, let's look at what's happening to consumption in the first half of this year, as well as investment and the other categories. Well, in the first half, consumption was up 1.5%, okay? 1.5% growth in consumption, 2/3 of the economy in the first quarter, all right? If you look at the goods section, the goods part of consumption, consumption is made up of services and goods. If you look at the goods part, that actually declined 2.3% in the first quarter, but it recovered in the second quarter of a positive 2.5%. Well, what explains why consumption, the biggest element in the economy, contracted in the first quarter, but grew in the second quarter? Well, it's pretty simple. It's the inflation adjustment. What do we mean by that? GDP is real GDP. Nominal GDP is all the goods and services sold at the price at which they're sold. We then adjust that nominal GDP by the inflation index to get real GDP. So if your inflation goes down, your real GDP goes up. It's just because inflation went down, okay? Not because you expanded anything, it's that the prices of stuff went down, and therefore your real output goes up. And that's what we saw between the first and second quarters of this year, right? Goods inflation and PCE index came way down. Therefore, what you see is real GDP goes up. Nominal GDP was 4.5% in the first quarter. It wasn't much different in the second quarter, 5.2%. But because inflation, the inflation adjustment was 2.4% instead of 3.1%, you get a statistical boost to real GDP of 0.7%. So that 2.8% is really 2.1% if it wasn't for that inflation adjustment, okay? Now, on top of that, there's a seasonality adjustment in the summer. Seasonality knocked, again, about 0.2% off of, or added 0.2% of to the inflation index. Okay, so 0.7%, another 0.2% off of 2.8%, it gives you 1.9%. Now, what also happened here in the second quarter was we had a big increase in business inventory spending. In the first quarter, it was negative. It was negative 0.42. In the second quarter, all of a sudden, we get a big explosion of business inventory of 0.82. So we get a swing of 1.2% in inventories. So it was the increase in inventories, along with the inflation adjustment, that really had the impact explaining why second quarter GDP was 2.8 and first quarter, was only 1.4. If you take out that excess inflation and seasonality adjustments and say, well, that was an excessive inventory, it's going to go down again, take an average of the inventory, you come up with an inflation, a GDP of second quarter, about the same of what it was the first quarter, about 1 to 1.5%. So in other words, the real economy did not really grow in the second quarter. This was the statistical redetermination of GDP, except for inventories. Inventories did grow. All right. So it's an important thing to keep in mind here when we talk about, is the real economy strong or not strong? Well, if you look at the real economy here, I've been saying for some time it's pretty weak. It's pretty weak. You got a 1 to 1.5% actual GDP normal long-term growth occurring in the first half of this year. And what do we see happening now, and why the real economy is going to continue to weaken? Well, first of all, real wages are not rising. That's the number one way in which people spend their income, their real wage income. And it's not really rising. You see figures of, wages are up 3.9%. Well, that's not adjusted for inflation. When you adjust it for 3% inflation, you get maybe a 0.8% increase in real wages. And then you got to adjust that because most of that's skewed to the high income level of workers, and those at the median and below haven't had a real wage increase. And now you got layoffs coming, particularly in tech, as the tech bust occurs. And these layoffs will mean less income to spend as well. So the contribution of real wages to consumption is not that strong looking forward here. Plus now you got credit card debt maxing out, over $1 trillion in credit card debt, and households are carrying largest balances ever, and delinquencies from month to month, and delinquencies are rising. So the ability to use credit cards to make up for lack of wage spending, I think, is reaching a limit here. You got auto debt where you got delinquencies rising, student debt. You got 19 million students who still haven't returned to paying their student loans. 38 million were given a moratorium during COVID. Only half of them have continued spending, repaying their student loans. I'm not saying that, but you got 19 million people in default student loans because they can't afford paying it, or whatever reason they're not paying it. All right. And then you got mortgages, 7% mortgages. All right. And that's a big factor, by the way, because as we'll see, mortgage interest and interest in general is not calculated in either the CPI or the PCE. It's a big part of monthly household spending. In other words, interest rates are rising. You got to take your income to spend that, but it's not reflected at all in the inflation indexes. Mortgage payments have gone up 114% since the end of COVID, 114%. Okay, that's taken a big bite out of people's spending here. And the point I'm making is all these factors mean that consumption, the main driver of GDP and the economy, is in a difficult spot. And I don't see any evidence how that's going to drive the economy to growth in 2025. We can look at investment. Business investment also contributes to GDP. What do we see? Well, we saw the excess inventory second quarter, but if you don't have consumer spending, business is going to continue expanding excess inventories, is going to work it off. So your inventories contribution to business investment is going to decline here in the second half as well. Also, the tech boom is over. You may not have picked it up, but it's very clearly over. And we saw that last week, right? With all this development with over there in Japan with the carrying trade. That was really the tech boom. I'll explain why. Busting in Asia, just as it's busting here in North America. Warren Buffett, the big investor, dumped $80 billion of Apple stock over the weekend or last week. $80 billion. Okay, that means a lot of other big investors are getting out of tech. because layoffs are coming and earnings are falling and the tech boom is over, which means a lot of the tech boom was driving business equipment investment in software. That's coming to an end as well. And then we have problems in commercial real estate, office buildings, hotels, factories, resorts, malls, apartment complexes. That's all commercial real estate. That's in a big funk. That's could be the next financial instability event next year. Net exports are slowing down because the global economy is slowing down. And we got government spending, which is facing this massive deficit and debt problem that we've got. The deficit this year will be $1.9 trillion. You probably heard about the total national debt's $35 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office says that it's going to go to $1.7 trillion interest on it. We're now paying $900 billion a year interest on that $35 trillion of debt, going to $1.7 trillion. I mean, that's way more than defense spending, way more than other discretionary spending. And who gets the $900 billion at $1.7 trillion? Bondholders, the 1%. They get that money, okay, not you and I. So they've got this massive problem of runaway fiscal debt and interest payments on the debt. You may have heard of modern money theory. It's a new area of economic theory that says, oh, deficits don't matter. Well, they don't matter, except interest payments on the debt do matter. Because that interest payment that's going to bondholders is going to be taken out of the hide of households. So next year, you're going to see a major austerity program, whoever gets elected, to cut social programs. And that's going to have a negative impact on the economy as well. So what you see going on with coming government spending cuts, with problems with investment, tech, the tech boom drying up, with net exports weakening, with household consumers tapped out. That's not a picture, a scenario for economic growth after 2025. And already they're saying, oh, the real economy is slowing. Yeah, it is slowing. Look at the Purchasing Managers Index for manufacturing. It's been contracting now for 8 months, and it's at its lowest point. The PMI is manufacturing at its lowest point. Look at construction. Took another dip down this summer. That's going to be a continued negative. Now, if they lower interest rates, it might re-stimulate that to some extent. We'll just have to see. But very clearly, construction is not going to stimulate the economy, and you're going to have a slowdown in business investment, and consumption is not going to pick up, and the government's going to have to cut spending as well. That's the real economy. Okay, that's what really matters. And yeah, you will see a continued slowdown in goods inflation, and even maybe in some sectors of services inflation, because the recession is coming. It's already here in the goods sector of the economy. We're already in a goods recession. Goods meaning what manufacturing makes, right? What construction is, whether residential or commercial. Real retail sales are negative as well. And net exports, these are all indicators of the goods sector of the economy in trouble and slowing down. Now, the services sector remains stubborn in terms of its contraction. And that's why you still see inflation in the services sector, right? You see it in particular in rents. Rents inflation still going on. You see it in auto repair going on. You see it in insurances going on, and medical services. These are areas where there's monopoly pricing power, some of them, and the big corporations are still using that power to jack up prices. Okay, which brings us to the question of inflation. And why do I say inflation, particularly services inflation, is higher than they're actually reporting, whether in the CPI or the PCE? Okay, the CPI is a basket of 450 or so most frequently household purchase goods and services. This is what we spend most of our money on. You know, there are millions of items out there, right? But really, believe it or not, you know, the vast majority of 450 things, you know, like food and gasoline and insurances and rent and things like that, right? That's what we spend it on. That's the CPI. Then you got the PCE, okay, which is all of the items, the millions in the economy that the Federal Reserve uses to reduce the inflation and come up with a larger GDP. Okay. The problem with the PCE is that it is goods heavy and if overweighted on the goods sector rather than services. So if the goods sector is coming down, which it is, right, you're going to get a lower inflation number with the PCE. And that's the one they cherry pick. They like that, just like they like the U3 unemployment rate, you know, and the establishment survey, 114,000 jobs, et cetera. That's the one you see, you know, in the media. So the PCE is lower for those reasons. The CPI is more accurate estimate of the cost of living, but that has certain problems as well. What are those problems with the PCI? Okay, well, or the CPI. What are the problems with CPI? Well, you got to understand that all of these indexes have a certain methodology and they have certain assumptions in that methodology that they use. And the assumptions are kind of questionable sometimes, in my opinion. For example, as I already said, the CPI basket of goods does not include interest rates, whether it's mortgage rates or credit card rates or whatever. We know those have all gone up. Mortgage is up 114%. And by the way, you know, don't look at housing prices, which are picked up in the CPI, because people don't pay a monthly housing cost or price. They don't pay for their housing price that they bought their house. They pay a mortgage, which includes the interest rate and other fees. That's what comes out of your monthly budget, not the price of the house, but the price of the house plus what you pay the bank, you see. And mortgage is up 114% since 2020, and housing is up 40%. Okay, big difference. Okay, but the point is the CPI and PCE don't include interest rates. I think that's a big negative because that's a big part of the inflation cost to households. What are some other examples? Well, insurances have gone up, right? House insurances, auto insurances. Well, does the government look at the insurance companies and ask them, how much did you raise your prices? No, they don't look at insurance prices. They look at insurance company profits and they extrapolate and assume prices from those profits. And if you can, you know, cut your taxes and so forth in various ways, you can lower your actual profit that you report to the government. And therefore your price of insurances is actually, when it's included in the CPI, lower than what you're actually paying. Here's another assumption. It's called hedonic pricing. The Labor Department assumes that an improvement in the quality of a product means that the price is lower. You may have bought an iPhone, for example, last year and paid $100 more because, you know, Apple keeps raising its price. But according to the government, you pay 10.2% less for your iPhone. Now you actually pay 10 more, but the government says, well, when we factor that into our CPI, it's actually 10% less because of the quality improvement assumed in the product. The same thing goes for cars and other electronic goods and PCs and so forth. These prices have all come down according to the government. Right? Actually, you're paying more, but in terms of its inflation index, it's less. Well, you know, I got a problem with that too. Food prices, right? here the companies play the large number of items game, right? What they do is the things that you buy the most, right? Maybe you're paying 20% more for your cereal, right? But because you're not paying any more for ketchup and spaghetti sauce or whatever, there's thousands and tens of thousands of items. They average it out. So it looks like, oh, total food prices over the past year are only up 1%. Does anybody going to a grocery store over the past year believe that their cost at grocery store is only up 1%? I don't think there's anybody out there who really believes that, but that's what the government number is. Food is 12%, 1%. How about food away from home, right? Well, they go by the menu that the restaurant may charge, but that doesn't include tips. And we know tips used to be like 10, 12, and 15%. Now you go to a restaurant and the tips are 18, 22, and 25. And in some places, they're automatic. And we have this thing called dynamic pricing going on, which the companies are using to really gouge everybody. What's dynamic pricing? In rents and in restaurants and foods, even in utilities. What's dynamic pricing? Well, they are able to use tech software to see when people are buying the item most, and the price goes up during the period of more intense purchases of the item. That's true at rents. Now, what that enables, for example, landlords to do is to see what the rents are and rising in different places in the city, and to keep raising and match those rent increases of their competitors. Or the software enables them as well to identify quickly where to raise the rent, or the fee or whatever, the additional fee, etc. Even the government now, I think, has initiated antitrust against these big landlords for using dynamic pricing to price gouge people and renters. And by the way, if you had a rent increase, the government says your rents only went up 4% last year. I don't know anybody who had a rent increase that only went up 4%. Okay, dozens of different base years that are used. There's a lot of technicalities I'm not going to go into. I started out as a labor economist, so I knew how these different numbers were determined and the methodologies and assumptions behind them. And we can see some questionable assumptions as well when we get to the jobs numbers. Once again, just as inflation numbers, we have CPI and PCE. When we get to the jobs numbers, we have the current establishment survey versus the current population survey. CES versus CPS. The CES is the one that gets reported in the media. What is the CES? It is the reports to the government by about 400,000 larger corporations who send information in, although only half of them are doing it now, into the government saying how many they hired and what their wages are, what the Labor Department reports. That's the CES. Right? That's the one that last month came in at only 114,000. Whoa, that's a big drop from the average of the previous year, monthly average of over twice that number. So very clearly, even that number is dropping. But what's the problem with that CES? The problem with that CES is even at 114, I believe it's overestimated. Why? Because in addition to getting the numbers from the large corporations every month, the Labor Department has this other item that it adds to that number that's reported by the large corporations, and it's called new business development model. In other words, the government assumes that every month a certain number of new small businesses are created, right? And a number of small businesses disappear. That number is in the hundreds of thousands. New businesses, hundreds of thousands every month are created. These are like proprietorships, right? And at the same time, many go out of business. Well, When you go into business, you got to file. I created this company with your state, state department or whatever it is in your state. So they know how many new businesses are formed, but they have no idea how many went out of business. Because when you go out of business, you don't report it. You don't have to report it. You just stop business. But the government takes a historic average and it plugs that number into that model. And it's a very static, low number, that doesn't change as a long-term historical average. And if you've got a period of recovery, you got a lot of new business formation, right? And they assume certain number of people for every new business created, and they take that raw number and they add it to what the enterprises, big companies send to the government. That becomes the database for new jobs created. And then they do a seasonality adjustment on that. Well, I think this BDM model distorts the number of jobs created, especially in a recovery period. Now, you don't get the unemployment number from the CES, this establishment survey. You get it from the population survey, which picks up smaller businesses better, right? And you get 4.3% unemployment rate. But as I said, that's only for full-time workers. What's going on with the other 47 million part-time workers? Well, they're picked up in what's called the U-6 unemployment rate, which is 7.4%. Right? 7.4% of 168 million people is what? 13, 14 million people unemployed, right? Not 6, 7 million. Almost twice as many unemployed than the one that gets reported in the press. Okay, so these are the way you got to be careful about unemployment and employment numbers, as well as inflation numbers. And the same thing with GDP. People aren't aware that in 2013, the government redefined GDP. In 2013, it added over $500 billion of economic activity by creating new categories. These categories were intellectual property, logos, trademarks, R&D, and all these things that weren't considered investment prior to 2013. They just added a category that added $500 billion to GDP and avoided reporting a double dip recession in 2013-14. Right? That's how they did it. And they've carried that forward ever since. So you got this phony category, really, of GDP called intellectual property, some of which is relevant, but a lot of which is not. Because, GDP is determined by adjusting for inflation. And the government simply assumes whatever a company says was the increase in the value of its logo and its trademark, and they pump it up, right, is the truth. The Nike's trademark goes up, $10 million. There's no proof of that, right? No proof of that at all. But anyway, there are a lot of games being played with statistics, and unless you know how to dig below them, and it's not as if they're falsified. It's their assumptions and methodologies are sometimes questionable. And it's also a problem of the media cherry picking the best ones and reporting the best ones, whether they are inflation or employment or GDP. But if you look beneath the surface, to sum up, inflation is worse than they are saying. Unemployment is worse than they're claiming. And the economy, the real economy, is doing worse than they're actually admitting. And that's where we're going forward here. In terms of the global economy, looking at the global economy, I'll just sort of wrap up here in 5 minutes, right? You've got European recessions, provoked largely because of US sanctions. The US drove, through its sanctions, drove the Russians out of the European economy, and it stepped in to the vacuum in those areas where the Russians left, and providing energy in particular to the Europeans at a cost of 3 and 4 times what they were getting from Russia. And that has brought the German economy in particular to a virtual halt. And there are other problems going on. Europe's barely growing. And a big part of that is the sanctions. Another part of it is, the U.S. is sucking investment capital out of Europe purposely. It's offering big tax cuts for European tech and other companies to relocate to the U.S., and they're doing it. The the Biden IRA tax cuts, so forth. Auto companies and others are moving, instead of investing in Europe, they're investing in the U.S., creating jobs here. There are other measures, that have to do with tariffs and so forth. The U.S. is making Europe increasingly dependent on the U.S. economy. Europe is becoming an economic dependency of the U.S. Through various means. So it's not growing very much. Of course, Japan has been flat for some time. And you put them all together, G7, G8, if you add Australia and New Zealand, you got very little growth going on in G7, G8, the global economy. And that's why U.S. exports, by the way, are declining, because you don't have this offshore sales growth for exports. And now we got the tech bubble busting. Last week you may have heard a lot about what happened with the Japanese carrying trade, right? What's the carrying trade? Carrying trade is an arrangement in which Japan keeps its interest rates virtually zero, and therefore its currency does not rise. It's stable and virtually zero appreciation. And that allows global investors to borrow Japanese yen at no cost and to use that yen to purchase, guess what? Other currencies in the stock boom. And what you saw last week, in Friday there, I think it was, with the Bank of Japan tried to raise interest rates by a quarter, and that upset that whole carrying trade, because now yen was not worth nothing. And the tech, everyone, big investors know tech has hit its apex. So the money they borrowed on the yen to buy Asian and American tech stocks in Asian stock markets, they sold off the stock, right? The tech stock, and they, bought down their debt of the yen. So you have the stock markets in Asia plummeting 10, 12% one day, right? And you had the unwinding of the carrying trade. At the same time, you have over in the US, big investors, as I said, like Warren Buffett, doing what? Dumping his tech stocks, turning into cash. Whenever you see big investors sell off their assets and hold cash, it means they see a recession coming. Because you don't want to hold assets when there's a recession, because the value of those assets collapse and you lose money. But if you turn it into cash, you don't lose money, you actually increase the real value of your cash when there are deflation going on. So really, it's like the canary in a coal mine. Warren Buffett, the carrying trade, and all these are symptoms and signals that the big investors are beginning to prepare for the recession that's coming. And pretty clear globally and in the US, and particularly in the G7 countries. Now we have this G7, to finish up, we have this G7 stagnation, economic stagnation going on. At the same time, we see the rise of the BRICS, right? Now there's 11 of them. 30 more have asked to join the BRICS before the end of the year. These are countries, the latest 5 or 6 of them that joined. The original BRICS are, China, India, Russia, and a few others there. And now they added all the not all, but many Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and so forth. The oil producers now saying we're not going to buy and sell oil with dollars. You see, dollars, the power of the dollar, which is the crux of the U.S. global economic empire, the U.S. dollar, right? Now that had to be used here during the empire. If you wanted to buy oil or commodities or most of anything, you had to buy dollars. And then the U.S. International Payment System, the SWIFT system, allowed U.S. banks and government to see who was using dollars and who was buying what. So sanctions only work with the SWIFT payment system. But when the BRICS say we're not going to use dollars anymore and we got our own payment system, well, then the U.S. can't see who's violating the sanctions anymore, right? So dollar is the linchpin. But if they stop using the dollar, right, that undermines the global empire. And they're going to come up with their own currency here in 2025, and that will accelerate the move from the dollar long term. Long term, I emphasize, as a transaction currency and as a reserve currency. Right? And of course, these countries are buying up gold as much as they can to use it in lieu of the dollar as their reserve. Now, what happens? I'll finish on this. What happens when the dollar declines in value? Because if they aren't using the dollar in global trade, right? I'm not buying dollars because I got to buy oil and whatever. I'm not bothering to buy dollars anymore. I don't need them. Well, that reduces the demand for dollars, doesn't it? Well, supply and demand, when you reduce demand, the price, the value goes down, doesn't it? That means long term, as countries, the BRICS of the South, move away from the dollar, the value of the dollar longer term is going to decline. Now, that causes problems in the domestic economy. What are they? Well, when the dollar declines in value, what global investors, including US corporations abroad, want to buy the dollar in order to buy US treasuries, right? If the value of something's falling, you don't want to buy it, of the asset, you don't want to hold it, right? So they're not going to buy the dollar in order to buy treasuries. Well, when that happens, the US and the Federal Reserve can't sell enough treasury bonds in order to cover the budget deficit of $1 to $2 trillion. So the Fed has to raise interest rates to attract foreign buyers as the dollar falls to buy more treasuries. So long term, interest rates are going to have to rise if the US wants to continue funding these massive deficits. So you see how the decline of the global empire and the dollar reverberates back onto the US domestic economy and causes negative consequences on that economy as well. Okay, I think I'm at about an hour, am I not? Yeah. So, all right, I'll leave it at, I hope this wasn't too technical, too much economist talk, whatever. But it's interesting, I think, to know what, one, the state of the real economy is, what the actual inflation and unemployment and GDP might be, right? Raise some questions about that. What are the trends in the real economy this year and going forward, and how this all connects to the global economy, in particular, the weakening of the global economic empire.
Well, thanks, Jack. We're going to switch to questions now. And what I'm going to ask people to do is raise your hand, and we'll take you in order. And I'm going to start off with a question just to get us going, and then while people line up. And I'm going to assume Justin's going to call on people after me. And my question is, in the second half of my lifetime, it's just like amazing how much the national debt has gone up at $35 trillion. And as you said, that's going to end up with $1.7 trillion in interest every year just to pay on that debt. And it just, and I don't see any end in that growing at all. And the only thing that's been saving us is the petrodollar, which is just bring all those dollars back in to buy treasury bills. And if we're going away from that, it seems like there has to be some kind of a collapse down the line. That debt just, or there's got to be some huge, deflation that dollars end up being not worth very much, because that debt, I don't see how that debt can ever get paid, because we don't have the output production, to end up with a trade surplus to end up paying this all down. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, well, let's look at the numbers. In 1980, the national debt was about $1 trillion. In 2000, it had risen to $6 trillion, all right? In the 24 years since then, it went from 6 trillion to 35 trillion. And by the way, both Democrat and Republican administrations contributed about the same to the deficit and debt. I think the deficit rose under Trump almost 6 trillion, 5.5 trillion, and he added about 7.8 trillion to the national debt. And under Biden, we get roughly the same thing, about 7 trillion in cumulative deficits. Accumulation of deficits add up to the debt, and about 7 point something trillion. So both administrations are responsible more or less equally for this big run-up. What's responsible for this big run-up? Well, look at, we go from 6 trillion to 35 trillion, right, in the last couple of decades. During this period, there have been about 17 trillion dollars in tax cuts, while we increased our war spending $8 trillion. Never in the history of the US have we ever went to war and cut taxes while we increase more spending. This is a first. This is total mismanagement. Okay. Now, most of that 17 trillion in tax cuts went to businesses and investors. Maybe 20% goes to households, to sweeten the pie, to pass the legislation. Trump's tax cut in 2018 was $4.5 trillion, I estimated at the time. The media said, oh, it's only $1.5 trillion, and I explained why it's not $1.5 trillion. And even liberals, Krugman and Reich, it's only $1.5 trillion. Well, that $1.5 trillion was based on the assumption that GDP would grow 3.5% for the next 10 years. Well, of course, it hasn't, right? And then they lowballed the tax cut for multinational corporations offshore. Right? So it's $4.5 trillion. But the point is, most of that 17 trillion has gone to investors and businesses. At the same time, we spent $9 trillion on wars. Well, there's 25 trillion of 35 trillion, right? Maybe a couple more trillion in government spending on government health programs as big pharma and insurance companies price gouged everybody, right? For Medicare and Medicaid and SCIP and all that stuff, a couple trillion there. Over the years. And then, of course, the bailouts, the $1 trillion in 2008-9 social spending, and the $3-4 trillion in 2021 social spending. All right. This number, by the way, doesn't include the $9 trillion in Federal Reserve debt. In other words, money given to the banks. 35 trillion doesn't count that. It doesn't count state and local government debt either, which is like 2-3 trillion on top of that. Doesn't count that. All right, we're talking about 35 trillion, just the federal government. But the point is 15-16 trillion, tax cuts 8-9 trillion, war spending, couple trillion, price gouging. And now we've got the fourth element here of this escalating interest on the debt at 900 billion now, going to 1.7 trillion as interest rates have stayed high. Now, I just want to say once again, I said earlier that there's this theory called modern money theory. Right? And they argue deficits don't matter. As long as you got resources in the economy, you can grow the economy, and pay for it out of taxes and whatever wealth that the economy grows, right? Well, there may be resources, but if you don't put them to use, it doesn't matter. And what does matter is you're at $1 trillion interest on the debt, and that is going to be used to hammer social programs going forward. That's the way they're going to try to address this, James, in the short run. They're going to try to cut social spending programs. Oh, they'll token raise, a tax here and there, right, to try to make it look good. And they'll say, oh, interest rates are coming down. But it'll be a Band-Aid on the problem, because the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, estimates that in 10 years, the total debt's going to be $54 trillion, right? It's unsustainable. It's a fiscal crisis. It's unsustainable. But they won't give up their tax cuts. That's what Trump wants. He wants more. He wants another $5 trillion, according to CBO, in tax cuts, mostly for the rich, right? And the Democrats won't give up their damn wars, None of them. 3 wars, 4 wars going, I don't know, so you face this double evil, right? Of which wing of the corporate party of America, which, Republican wing or the Democrat wing. They are really a single party. They have the same foreign policy. They have basically the same major economic policies. They have the same policies with limiting democracy wherever and whenever they can, right? And they got a Supreme Court who just opened up everything to the big companies. Okay, so that's my answer to that.
All right, next we have a hand raised. Margot Smith, go ahead and unmute.
Yes, thank you. I'm concerned about the housing crisis, and one of the concerns I have is that you hear all the politicians talking about building affordable housing, but affordable housing is based on the median household income. And in the old days, we used to use per capita income, which is much more accurate. And is there any do you have any ideas about the use of median income for estimating the need for affordable housing? Like, for example, here in the Bay Area, an affordable house is based on our county household income of 109,000 a year. So affordable housing is for people who make 100,000 a year. I'd like
Yeah,
to hear what you have to say about that.
yeah, I think a lot of Newsom's programs are smoke and mirrors, actually. 109,000. I mean, the people who really need housing don't have annual incomes even half of that, right?
Right.
Even half of that, right? I mean, even 55,000, 65,000, the median, the actual median is 65,000 nationwide. And I've done estimations of what the real median income need is to survive, not just in California, but in any urban area. It's about $96,000 a year income to survive. I won't go into the details of that, but the government says it's 67,000. But those who need housing have incomes far lower than that. So it's really a boon to the real estate industry, as I see it, because a lot of homeless people or low income people are not going to be able to afford the so-called affordable housing.
Well, that's exactly what's happening.
Yes, that's what's happening. It's really a boon to the real estate and construction industry, and the politicians, claim that they're doing something, and there'll be more homes for the upper half of the income scale, right? But those who really need it, it won't be there. They won't be able to afford it.
Do you have a solution?
Well, not given the political scenario we have, you would have to have a mass construction of housing here, run by a government corporation, a government corporation, a new kind of housing corporation, that actually provides that. But the problem in the Bay Area is, a lack of space. It would have to be subsidized by the government because the price of the land is such that you can't build affordable housing where someone 30,000-40,000 annual income can actually afford it. A solution though might have something to do with what we did during the Great Depression. How did we ease the crisis on housing and people losing their homes during the Great Depression? During the 1930s, the typical duration of a mortgage loan was only 10 years. Well, what the government did when it stepped in to relieve people was to say, okay, refinance that to 30 years, and it dropped the monthly cost significantly. So maybe the government needs to come in and subsidize mortgages and say 50-year mortgages, to get that price down to where people 40, 50,000 might be able to afford it. So the government's going to have to subsidize it somehow, whether it's through mortgages or whatever. That's the solution, the only solution I can see. But the government isn't going to do that. They're not going to. This government, either party, is not going to subsidize housing for those who really need it.
All right, next up, Bill Balderston. Go ahead and unmute.
Thank you, Jack, for a very informative talk. I'd like to sort of shift the gear a little more to the global side, talking about supply chain problems and thinking especially about the integration of sorts of the US and Chinese economies, and the fact that The Chinese economy seems to be hitting a rough stretch right now. And in addition, the US has a desire to, there's no way they can totally de-link, but sort of move, at least to some extent, some industries out of China. Um, how do you think this is going to play out in terms of inter-imperialist competition and on a financial level? So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, the U.S. has been at war economically with China since 2018. That's when Trump launched, his war, economic war, tariff war against China, and the whole objective of that was really to slow Chinese next generation technology development. AI and cloud computing and all this, next gen stuff, cybersecurity, et cetera. It didn't work. A tariff approach to China to try to get them to stop their tech development didn't work. I mean, the tech development is crucial for military, next generation military as well, weaponry. So China's not going to change that. It's not going to slow it down. Biden gets in, and Biden's approach has been to actually embargo certain things, certain parts and whatever to China. So he was a little tougher on China, right? Tariff didn't work approach, so he got the more direct approach. But that's not working either. If you look at some of China tech developments, they're actually ahead of the U.S. in AI. They are filing far more tech patents, AI patents, than even the U.S. is. And then you've got supercomputing and quantum computing and other leading edge tech areas, and the Chinese are not slowing down in that particular area. So the tech war, or the war, economic war with China, is going to intensify. It would be a lot worse right now if it wasn't for the U.S. embroiled, in Ukraine and in the Middle East and the Red Sea and all the other places, right? It would be worse. The U.S. is trying to sort of stabilize the economic war with China, put it on a back shelf, and then when necessary, bring it back out again. And I think that will happen eventually here. But financially, what you see is not just tech. The U.S. is trying to get semiconductors and other key strategic tech sectors out of Asia and relocate to the U.S. And that's part of its long-run military plan. But it's having a spillover effect to other non-military tech sectors. Very clearly, China is subsidizing and helping its electric car industry, and that's causing Tesla some problems, some hiccups, and its iPhone industry and other sectors, consumer tech sectors. China is pushing its own domestic tech, and as it doesn't need the U.S., and it's pushing it out. So the relationship will continue over the long term, of decoupling, I think, between the economies, between the two. They're still, intensely integrated. On the financial side, or the growth side, the China GDP, yeah, they are struggling a little bit. They shut down, and you can't shut down consumption and household income and then expect to turn it around on a dime, right? As we saw in this country as well as in China. And they try to come out of it later than us. So they got a little problem there. But they are re-emphasizing exports again, and that's causing a lot of heartburn to U.S. companies and the U.S. itself, particularly in Europe. So financially, yeah, they seem to have this lingering problem of debt in their residential real estate sector, but they seem to be controlling it. I think they're a lot better off. And now with the BRICS, you're going to see China turning to a lot of exports to the global south here, rather than to Europe and to the US. I think that will harm the US and Europe more than it will harm China. Those are my, eclectic observations on China.
All right, next up, Leslie. And Leslie has some comments in the chat, but now you can follow up. Thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious about alternative measurements to GDP. And I'm not an expert, but I'm curious about how we can measure the good and not measure everything. And I was curious about there's what they call a well-being economics, which would measure, the well-being of people and the planet instead of the well-being of financial markets and corporate entities. So any thoughts on any of those issues?
Well, financial markets aren't included, stock markets, currency, whatever, in the calculation of GDP. It's supposed to be the real economy. And there are problems, as I've talked about, in estimating real GDP. I won't go over them again. It's been a topic among progressive economists for a couple of decades now to point out the limitations of GDP in terms of whether this is, they're counting really socially beneficial activity. Technically, you could pollute the hell out of the country and raise GDP and then spend money correcting the pollution and raise it even more, right? That's a good typical example. They call those externalities, right? There's a lot of externalities that get counted in GDP that really don't benefit people. So there's always been, Joseph Stiglitz, I think, and some other economists have in years past, not much activity on it nowadays, have talked about, and the French economists, I think, how to create alternative measures to GDP that would factor in more beneficial, humanly beneficial estimates of growth and not count the things that aren't humanly beneficial. But it hasn't gotten very far, right? And it's not likely that it will. I think we're kind of stuck with GDP, and you should treat GDP as just a general estimation of a trend, right? Don't take the numbers as accurate and the last word on what the economy is really doing. I mean, if it's moving in a certain direction, then you're probably moving in terms of growth, but you don't know how much exactly, and vice versa on the way down. So unfortunately, it's the only national measure we got, although there is now a lot more, I should say, activity on estimating cross-national GDP by adjusting the different inflations in the different countries. As I've said very clearly, GDP is measured by the market price times whatever was sold, right? You get, that's called nominal GDP. But if the composition of inflation in the US is different than what it is in Mexico, then simply adjusting Mexico's GDP by US inflation rates is not going to get you an accurate number. So there's this thing called PPE, purchasing parity pricing, which in some ways is more an art than a science too, in which they try to adjust for the differences in inflation and the way inflation is calculated across countries. And if you do that, PPE, GDP, you get China a bigger economy than the US. And you get Russia a bigger economy than Germany, for example, or Japan, I think, Germany or Japan, whatever. That's PPP analysis. But as I said, there's a lot of art to that. It's very hard to know what actual inflation is in different countries, particularly in other countries where you don't have as much data capturing as you do in the US. I mean, you go to Zimbabwe, how do you know what the hell the inflation is? Well, how are you going to determine? You don't have data collection, let alone the methodologies by which they manipulate then the data, right? Whether it's inflation adjustment, seasonality adjustment, BDM, or all this stuff we're talking about, right? It's very difficult. But, once again, PPE can give you a sense of maybe magnitudes, right? And the direction of change. That's about the best you can say. Unfortunately, we don't have anything better.
All right, next, James McFadden.
Jack, I'm going to ask you another question. Capitalism requires growth. Otherwise, nobody's going to want to invest. If you're going to see your money shrinking, you're not going to invest in stuff. And so there's been a couple things. There's a constant effort to create the next growth product. And it seems like this high tech, including AI and quantum computing and denser chips and all stuff, is all designed around to create this next growth round. But that growth round is for stuff that really we don't need. I mean, do you really need a faster cell phone? Do you really need a faster computer at home for most people? It seems to be generated about stuff, in fact, the only thing that we really need these systems for is for war and surveillance, it seems to me, and not for actual things that, that people need, which is like clean food, clean water, better housing and all this stuff. None of these new growth products. And then on top of that, we're hearing a lot of concern about declining birth rates. So GDP also requires, or it's impacted by growth in population. And so there's all these worries about declining birth rate that are starting to pop up in the literature. And in fact, one of the things that kind of ties those together is I keep seeing back to the AI, I'm getting advertisements on my, whenever I go on YouTube, I'm getting advertised all the time about how great AI, when I turn my computer on in the morning, AI is going to solve all the problems in the world, this kind of propaganda about what AI is going to do. And whereas I think it's going to make the world a very surveillance and make war easier to fight because you don't have to send people in because you can send robots in. Anyway, if you can comment on this, those two things, this concern about birth rate and whether we really do need this, all these new high-tech things.
Well, the attraction of AI, and it has generated billions and billions of investments, some say $1 trillion, right? Why is business so interested in AI? Because it cuts their labor costs, right? It's cost cutting, potentially, and that means profit generating. Goldman Sachs banks a couple of years ago estimated that AI would generate 300 million lost jobs within the decade. 300 million. That's the bank, Goldman Sachs Bank, right? I've been saying that a long time, because what is AI? AI is about eliminating simple decision making and letting software make the decisions, which means a lot of services, not just manufacturing. It's not just robots, and manufacturing workers. There's a lot of it is simple decision-making jobs, customer service people and retail people and back office accountants and all this stuff, right? It means they're going to get laid off. They're going to get eliminated. And then the question is, how are we going to employ, millions or more in this country of people in the next 10 years are going to get laid off in simple jobs. These are the part-time jobs that people are doubling up on in order to survive. A lot of those are going to go away. But it's all about raising productivity. In other words, when you eliminate jobs and you have the same output or increase the output, your productivity goes up. If your productivity goes up, your unit labor costs go down, your profits go up. This is what it's all about. But a lot of it is still a lot of hype and a lot of it's a fake boom, which is beginning to unravel. Why is that? Because businesses are beginning to find out that it's not just the question of adding AI to a part of your business. Right? It's not that simple, because if AI means you're using massive cloud available databases. You're getting information everywhere, not from your own server on site, but from everywhere, right? And you're processing it at light speed, and you're coming up with trends that's presumably help you in marketing, help you in reducing employment and whatever. But to do this, businesses are finding they don't have the data architecture to be able to handle this massive data acquisition and processing. And they're beginning to find out, whoa, it's going to cost me a hell of a lot to implement AI. What's my return? How much am I going to really get? I mean, I was in tech for 20 years, and I've seen this hype time and time again. Oh, this is going to reduce your costs, right? And it costs more oftentimes than you do. So the point is that, we're seeing a bust of tech and AI right now. It will sort of reorganize itself and take off again once it gets smarter about it. A lot of investors are making a lot of money in the stock market over AI now. I mean, that's the big boom, right? But that's going to unravel. But AI is a major threat to employment over the long term. I've said many times that there are three areas here that may mean capitalism does not survive mid-century. What are those three? One is AI. What are you going to do with tens and hundreds of millions of people that you don't want to provide any income to or can't provide or whatever? What are you going to do for those people? AI is a big threat. The other big threat is climate change. I don't see the capitalists able to get ahead of that curve at all. In fact, they're falling behind that curve. We're already at 1.5% Celsius that we were supposed to not reach until we were at 2040 or something. I don't see any solution to tech solution or whatever. I don't see them really doing the investments. The government won't do it. What's necessary because it's controlled by the corporations, and the corporations won't do it. So that's the second major threat. The third major threat is the US empire. As it declines and the wolf gets cornered and gets desperate, as it's getting right now, and launches all these wars, which it's doing right now, that's a sign of the empire in decline. And someone's going to make a mistake. Some neocon is going to say to Ukraine, okay, you can use tactical nukes or whatever, and then we are at Armageddon. I'm really worried about that, about the empire getting desperate and a mistake being made. Not necessarily a plan, but a mistake being made as the U.S. confronts its major challenges, Russia and China, right? A mistake could be made. So I don't have much confidence in the neocons and U.S. foreign policy here. I think they're dumber than dirt, when it comes to the economy or politics or whatever. And these people who are in both wings of the corporate party of America and been running it since 2001 are going to lead us to, a dramatic mistake. Anyway, those are the three, to comment on capitalism, those are the three big threats I see by mid-century.
Right, we're close to the end. We have two hands raised. What I'd like to do is take Najeen and then Carol, 30 seconds each, and then back to you, Jack, to respond and wrap it up. And then that will close us out. So first, go ahead and unmute Najeen.
My question was about U.S. foreign policy and about all these embargoes and restrictions we have of so many countries now. And yet these countries are standing on their feet, and 1,000-something people will take on the U.S. hegemony in the shape of Hamas. And they will have no food and no water and continue to fight. And in all the other countries like Iran, embargoes going on forever, South America. And what is really actually happening to the U.S. economy as it does all this?
Yeah, well, in the 21st century.
And could we also get, let's hear from Carol, just so that we can get everyone in, and then over to you, Jack. Go ahead, Carol, please unmute. Carol, can you please unmute?
I was wondering if there's any good investment a person can make in light of what's happening. For example, should you try to keep your house or should you not?
Okay,
Thanks, Carol.
all right. Well, on the first question, the world today is not what it was in 1980, in the 80s, right? How is it fundamentally different? Well, as I said, it's financialized and globalized, but the big difference, I think, is that the global South has industrialized. It's not backward anymore, and the US simply cannot dictate to the global South, which includes China and others, right? India, et cetera, anymore. They're just not willing to go along with it. They want to be more independent of the global empire. And the US is resisting that, trying to force them back into the empire on the same terms. And that's what's fundamentally different. And that's why Russia is able to avoid, and China, avoid the effect of the sanctions, which used to work in the past as a weapon of US foreign policy, but it doesn't work anymore because they just sell to the, industrializing, advancing global South. It's a different world. And the US empire can't win in that particular fight. It has to come to terms with it, but right now it's trying to resist it. We'll see whether it comes to terms and tries to cooperate with it or not in the next 4 years. I was in the labor movement a long time, 15 years as an organizer and a local union president and negotiator and so forth. And in some real strikes that I won't talk about. But anyway, what I've saw is that sometimes you can push people so far and they just don't give a damn anymore. They don't care what you do to them. They don't care if you kill them or whatever, We didn't see that, of course, in the Union, but you can see this in the world, in the Middle East and other places. People, you can't use force to bring them in line anymore. They just won't do it. It's kind of like a general strike. It's like the world is launching a general strike against the empire, right? Like we had general strikes. I wrote a play years ago, 1934, about the San Francisco general strike. And the reason, the maritime workers won, they just didn't care. You couldn't stop them. You couldn't force them. You couldn't kill them or nothing anymore. Well, I think we're that way politically. We got a global political strike emerging here, and it doesn't matter what the dumbass neocons do. People aren't going to fall in line, and I think that's the major thing to consider here, and along with the fact the global South is not dependent anymore economically on the empire, and it wants to go its own way. As far as personal investment. Well, I'm not a fiduciary advisor, but if there is a recession, the number one thing is to get into cash, right? Get rid of those assets, financial assets that are going to collapse. Get into cash. Hold on to your house. Don't sell your house, right? And get out of debt if you can, and hunker down and watch your investments. Don't invest. I mean, like Warren Buffett's telling you what to do. He's doubled his cash holdings in 3 months, right? He's gone to $300 billion. He's turning into cash. He knows what the hell's coming, right? Follow Warren.